And we're recording. So I'm going to begin our presentation. This is a ballot argument workshop in anticipation of our November 3rd election. And these are our objectives today. We want to go over some of the statutory deadlines with you. We want to talk about some of the code sections that dictate our process. We want to tell you who's eligible to submit what. We'll discuss forms and fees. There's going to be some tips, one of which you will hear me repeat like every other thing out of my mouth. We'll be telling you to submit early, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So we can talk about deadlines and statutory dates. The assignment of letters to ballot measures will occur on Monday, the 3rd at 11 a.m. We have one bond measure that's forthcoming, and that lets us know that that will be Measure A, simply because the city charter and ordinances dictate the hierarchy for lettering the types of legislation, whether it's an ordinance, declaration of policy, bond, charter amendment, and so forth. So on Monday at 11, we'll draw these all from a jug, and you'll know no on C, yes on E, whatever it is that you're working on, you'll have some more info then. The deadline for submitting official opponent and proponent arguments is August 13th at noon. Following all of these deadlines for argument submittals, there's going to be a 10-day public examination period. So typically that big table that you saw in our lobby area, we'll just create folders that we put the official arguments in, and they'll be open for anyone to review. We don't... when we do intake of these, we basically look that folks' names are verified, that if they're invoked, that all of the forms necessary are there, but we don't offer any challenge to the factual or opinion basis of an argument, and we don't change those unless we have a writ of court. So if you saw something objectionable in a public examination period argument, you basically would have a formal system to work through to challenge that. Rebuttals for official arguments are due August 17th at noon. And just as we had for the original proponent and opponent arguments, there's a 10-day examination period thereafter. So these deadlines, that's the last second you can do it. That's not recommended. I know that those are dates that are in bold, and that's basically to tell you that if you miss this date, you're sunk. I cannot emphasize enough, earlier the better. The deadline for paid arguments submission is August 17th at noon. And you'll notice that that's the same deadline for rebuttals. So if you are doing a rebuttal to an official argument, you probably don't want to wait in line with everyone else that's paying their way into the VIP. And I encourage you to coordinate with us. Again, there's a 10-day examination period for rebuttals. And the volume of submission for paid arguments can be great. So make your best effort in submitting early. Some important info regarding deadlines. It's the last legally admissible time for us to take these. There's no such thing as exceptions. There's no such thing as accidents or extenuating circumstances. There's no grandfathering. There's not a signature in the world that allows us to extend that deadline. It's defined by law, and we follow it as the law, which is why we encourage you to submit early, because if there's any issues with your application, we want all parties some time to resolve those. Doesn't first sound better than last? Wouldn't it be wonderful to say mine was the first one to come in as opposed to I barely made it and we're the last? Official submitters will still be able to view contrasting arguments prior to crafting a rebuttal. And what I'm getting at is that there's no inherent advantage chronologically in deferring your submittals. If you have an official argument, you get to see the opposing view, and you get to consider that as you craft your rebuttal. So I wouldn't fixate on kind of stagnating submissions or how that comes into play. Paid arguments are printed in the order in which they are received and time-stamped. So what that means is in the book, when you have all those paid arguments, the first one that we receive is the first one that we print. Does anyone know when we begin intake of these arguments? It's a trick question. There's no set statutory date. You could bring them in now, the first paid argument for any of these measures. We could be doing intake of it in the lobby as we sit here going over this now. And I emphasize that as a means to encourage you to submit early. On the day of, that 17th, there'll be a line of people who are all fixating their place in line and how it will affect where they're printed in the VIP, when in reality, had they come in a week or two earlier, they would have assured a place closer to the front, and they would have saved us some grief coming in on a deadline day. So it's mutually beneficial, those early submissions. Again, too, we will personalize our attention, we'll reduce wait times, we'll be able to explain things more thoroughly and in a more personable manner if you come in prior to deadlines so that we can work with you. Code sections that dictate this process. There's going to be a few that are referenced, but predominantly you want to direct your attention to Article 5. When you're reading the code, that's going to be any section that's in that 500 field. And you see I denote it's 525 through 565. I know sometimes a code, it can be dense, it can be confusing, it's not very friendly to read. The amount of text that kind of covers all of these issues in the SF Municipal Elections Code is probably less than that's on your handouts. So don't let the fact that it's a code passage discourage you from learning more, because also that's the only thing that's resolute. And if you had an issue that you raised within the context of the code, it's much different than if you just simply misunderstand the process. California Elections Code also is going to dictate some of the policies regarding arguments. That's going to be on a less specific basis because it is statewide. Who may submit? So there's a defined hierarchy as to who's able to submit official proponent and opponent arguments. And the proponent of the initiative gets the right of first refusal. For any reason they did not submit an argument to us, then the Board of Supervisors or the mayor might be eligible to submit that argument. However, submission of that argument from those elected officials requires a motion. So that means it has to be put forth the Board of Supervisors. They have to make a motion to basically assign penmanship or author privileges to a member. If a Board of Supervisor member came in here on the morning of the 17th and said, I have an official argument, and there was no motion and there was none of that administrative detail, they'd be treated the same as any other registered voter who came in. They wouldn't get any priority in the random lottery for picking proponent and opponent arguments. They'd have to stand in line like anyone else. There's no gravitas with being an official if you don't go through the motion. So just be sure if you're working with any elected officials, there's a mindfulness towards that. Any registered San Francisco voter, group of voters, or organization comprised of voters is welcome to submit. And for proponent and opponent arguments, the official arguments, there's been changes in the code. And those changes state that submitters may only present one argument per a measure, and that they must sign a declaration that affirms they're a true proponent or a true opponent. And we'll talk about some of those forms more in a moment. So kind of dovetailing who may submit, what measures will be eligible for official submittal selection? What does this mean? So these are the different measures that will be going before the voters. These are a list of either proponents or elected officials that have had motions authorizing them to author proponent and opponent arguments. See these TBDs on the right? These are the arguments that will be subject to the random lotto. When people submit that, when we talk about one argument per measure per voter, they have a right to submit those arguments, and on the 13th, when we do the selection of proponent and opponent arguments, we will randomly select opponent arguments for these. And we're giving this presentation on July 30th. Something were to change between now and the 13th, that's subject to change, but it gives you a good idea as to the scope of what our random selection will be. Forms. Don't be too intimidated. They're really, so far as paperwork, there's not a huge amount of forms. There's maybe 4 different ones or 5 different ones that you would need. And I say that also saying there are some arguments that will only necessitate a single form. but all of our forms are available online as PDFs. We're going to ask that these argument sheets, these control sheets, that you print in legal size. The reason being is just because there's arguments on them and so much text, it's easier for our staff to do word counts when it's less compressed. If you pull up the control sheets online and you do a save as option and you save it locally on your own computer, that's going to be positive for a few things. First of all, more of the forms are fillable, so it's going to be easier for you to type things in. And then furthermore, if you're submitting multiple arguments, but some of your information is the same, meaning I'm authoring arguments for multiple ballot measures, you can save as, and instead of having to start from the beginning, you can just modify accordingly prior to submitting. We are going to ask for electronic submittals whenever possible. In addition to these you have to come in and submit these in person. It's not something that you can do remotely. And we're going to ask you to email your arguments to us as well, just to save the typing for our publication team. And to your advantage, it's going to help us in that you know what you sent us, and there's less ambiguity as to what may be printed then. Let's see here. So every argument is going to necessitate control sheet A. Every single one. If you have an argument that has multiple authors, then you're going to need control sheet B as well. And we're going to seek original signatures, and as authors must be registered San Francisco voters, we're going to seek accurate voter registration info to accompany those original signatures. So if someone signs as an author, we're going to look them up in the voter registration database. We're going to ensure that they are a registered voter. We're going to ensure that the information they provided, meaning the address and signature, are accurate. Then we're going to allow that argument for consideration. On control sheet B, there's also a box for your ballot text, or your ballot argument text. We're going to ask that that's filled out on both of these. The reason being is that we're going to seek some affirmation that these folks who designated themselves as authors know what, in fact, they were putting their name on. So the argument, some folks will fixate as to the order of names as they appear within the ballot argument measure. We have to print our authors' names at the bottom of your argument. However you state that at the bottom of your argument is how we're going to publish it. Consent sheets. So if you invoke a name within the body of your argument and they may not necessarily be an author, I have an example. Join Governor John Doe in submitting Measure X. Then we would seek a consent form from you, and that would have Governor John Doe's, they're telling us, what type of argument is it, what is it for? And then just like those control sheet Bs, we're going to seek the body of text in here so that Governor John Doe knows what he's consenting his invocation of. All official argument submittals, meaning proponent and opponent, those ones that we pick randomly if they haven't been assigned, are going to require a declaration related to proponents and opponents arguments. And this is one of our newer forms. It's very quick to fill out. And this is basically someone stating that it's not a straw argument or that they are not submitting multiple arguments. And it's just a formality. If you have questions, let us know. Last one, and this is one we'll see less, is the acknowledgement of submitting handwritten documentation. So if someone just took the control sheet and wrote in everything as opposed to typing it, or as opposed to printing it and using an adhesive to put it on that form, we would require them to sign this. And this basically says we can't be held responsible if you have illegible penmanship. So it's just kind of a caveat emptor. Fees for paid arguments. $200 to get your foot in the door, and $2 per word contained within document. That's going to include those names of authors that you have to put at the bottom. The word count methodology is outlined in the ballot argument guide that you have. 300 word count for the official proponent and opponent arguments and paid arguments. 250 word count for rebuttals. But I'm going to give you some advice in that context, in that you have 300 words. So I'm going to discourage anyone from writing a 299-word argument, because really you probably want to give yourself about a 10-word buffer for if there's any divergence in interpretation of the count. If you say it's 299 and one of our clerks says it's 306, we're marking it as 306, and you don't want to be in a situation where you're at the counter trying to play copy editor. So think 300, perhaps shorten it so that you have a safety buffer, and then additionally shorten that a little bit more so that you can get the names and titles of any authors that you're submitting within the body of that. Another, I'm going to re-emphasize, early is better. The order of intake and date stamping will dictate the order in which arguments are published. So on the top right of these forms, you see where we place our date stamp. When we get our paid arguments, we will line them up sequentially, so please get them in as soon as possible. Some just general tips: always call ahead, even if it's for something simple. If you contact us ahead of time, we can prepare materials in anticipation of your arrival, and instead of us running around and pushing paper, it'll be all nice and clean waiting for you. You'll spend less time in our office. You can avoid unnecessary wait times. If we have an event going on and I know that the lobby will be jammed, you'll find that out before you come in. There are no inherent advantages in deferring your submittal. The odds of official selection are all the same. All authors are able to view contrasting arguments prior to writing rebuttals. And we print paid arguments in the order in which they're submitted. So if there's a reason why people wait until the deadline, practically it's certainly lost on me. That's going to conclude kind of the scripted portion of our presentation. I'm going to open the floor up to questions. Again, if you guys have questions you want to ask us aside, you're welcome to.
So just on that last point,
yes.
If on the advantages of deferring the submittal or non-advantages, if I submit my official argument tomorrow, can the opposing or supporting side view my official argument before they submit their official argument?
I believe that we're going to wait until the deadline for public examination. That's kind of the intent of public examination, that we kind of lay everything out. Everyone's able to come in. If someone sees something that they feel is errant, if they need to metabolize that information in crafting, that's exactly how we would do it.
Thank you.
And if you do happen to wait for the deadline, if you're in line at the cutoff at noon, or do you have to be served by?
Oh, that's a suspiciously irresponsible question. Well, my first answer is don't put yourself in that position. My second answer is that at noon, we essentially stop the line. No one is getting in the line. We'll have a deputy station. Okay. We will be sticklers. There'll be no, like, I was parking the car, or I was in. You'll know if you're too late. The line will close behind you. You won't be allowed in.
But you can be in the line.
You can be in the line. You know, we're hoping, one reason why we're trying to cut down the volume on the deadline is so that we don't have to deal with those issues. Like, oh, I was in line, but it wasn't time stamped or what. So submit early, please. Yeah, and you know, I understand these things. Sometimes you leave here and in an hour you're thinking about it and the question comes, or you read the material. So please consider us a resource. Because we're trying to encourage those early submittals, anything we can do to make your life easier or facilitate the process, we'll jump to it. So unless anyone has any immediate questions for the benefit of the group, I'm going to close down today's presentation. We're going to be doing these workshops. Basically the same presentation you saw today we'll post on the web. And then additionally we're going to be doing a live presentation, essentially the same materials, each week for the next 2 weeks. And we're trying to invite people in, hopefully to encourage them to submit earlier than they have in the past, because we feel it's for the benefit of everyone. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.